I 17 female have an older sister, Sarah, who is 28. I love her deeply, we've always been close despite the big age gap, but, to be honest, we clash a lot. She has a really self-destructive streak that makes it hard for me to be around her sometimes. Sarah isn't the kind of person who likes to admit she's wrong, and she has this tendency to dig her heels in even when everyone else can see that she's spiraling. She has a lot of good qualities too, she's funny and can be so loving when she wants to be. But when things go south in her life, she tends to drag people down with her. And recently, things have gone very, very south. A couple of weeks ago, Sarah's boyfriend broke up with her. They had been together for about a year, and honestly, their relationship was rocky from the start. Sarah has a very anxious attachment style, which she has talked about openly. She tends to overthink and over-explain everything, which puts a lot of pressure on the other person. On the other hand, her ex was the complete opposite. He has an avoidant attachment style, so he shuts down when things get too intense. It was like they were constantly triggering each other, even though I know they cared about each other. They're both in therapy and have been diagnosed with these attachment styles, so it's not like they're unaware of the dynamic. But it was a mess, and their communication issues eventually led to the breakup. Since then, Sarah has been an emotional wreck. At first, I was completely understanding. Breakups are awful, and I know how much she struggles with feelings of abandonment. She started leaning on me for support almost immediately, and I was there for her as much as I could be. I listened to her vent, I gave her advice when she asked for it, and I even stayed up late a few nights just to keep her company. But after about a week, it became clear that she wasn't really interested in moving forward or trying to heal. Instead, she started spiraling into this really destructive behavior. Sarah has always been someone who bottles things up and then explodes. She'll act like everything is fine, but underneath, she's barely holding it together. That's exactly what's been happening these past couple of weeks. She's been drinking a lot more than usual, going out to random bars, and making really reckless choices. I've had to pick her up from strangers' houses more times than I can count, and each time, she acts like I'm the bad guy for not being there fast enough or for being annoyed with her. It's exhausting, but I kept telling myself, she's going through a breakup. She needs me right now. I guess I was trying to be the bigger person, but honestly, it was wearing me down. The breaking point came a couple of nights ago. Sarah had gone out with some friends, and at around 3 in the morning, she called me. She sounded drunk and panicked, and she told me she was at some random guy's apartment and needed me to pick her up. I didn't even hesitate, I got out of bed, got dressed, and drove to get her. When I got there, she was standing outside, looking completely disheveled, and I could tell she'd been crying. She got in the car and immediately started complaining about how long it took me to get there. I was half asleep and already annoyed, but I just apologized and started driving. As we were driving, she launched into one of her usual rants. She started saying that I don't understand what she's going through and that I don't care about her. This is something she says a lot when she's upset, and normally, I try to let it roll off my back. But that night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had been bending over backward to support her, sacrificing my own sleep and sanity, and she was acting like I was some kind of villain for not being perfect. I snapped. I told her that I do understand what she's going through because I've been through my own share of heartbreak. I reminded her that I was cheated on and verbally abused in my last relationship, and I told her that just because I don't broadcast my pain doesn't mean I haven't experienced it. I told her that it's not my job to babysit a 28-year-old woman who refuses to take responsibility for her own actions. I said she needs to go back to therapy and start dealing with her issues instead of dragging everyone else into her mess. My voice was shaking by the end of it, and she just sat there in stunned silence. The rest of the drive was completely quiet. When we got to her apartment, she got out of the car without saying a word, and I drove home feeling both guilty and justified. Part of me felt bad for blowing up at her because I know she's in pain, but another part of me felt like she needed to hear it. I can't keep setting myself on fire to keep her warm, especially when she refuses to help herself. It's been almost 2 days since then, and I haven't heard a word from her. A mutual friend told me that Sarah is mad at me because she feels like I was invalidating her pain. Apparently, she thinks I was trying to make her feel bad for being sad about the breakup, which wasn't my intention at all. I was just trying to set some boundaries and make her see that her actions have consequences. Now I'm stuck wondering if I went too far or if I was right to stand up for myself. So, AITA for what I said to my sister. Update 1. After 2 days of complete silence from Sarah, I decided it was time to be the bigger person. I didn't want to let this spiral into something bigger than it needed to be, and even though I was still upset, I cared about her. I sent her a text, "Hey, are you okay? I'm worried about you." It wasn't anything dramatic, just a simple message to check in and maybe start a conversation. Hours passed with no response. Each minute that ticked by made my anxiety climb higher. Had I really messed up that badly? Was she lying somewhere feeling abandoned, just stewing in resentment? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the typing bubble pop up on my phone. When her reply came through, though, my heart sank. All it said was, "I'm fine. Don't worry about me." That didn't feel fine. It felt distant and cold. I wasn't satisfied with her brushing me off, so I decided to call her. Maybe if she could hear my voice, she'd understand that I wasn't trying to fight, I just wanted to make sure she was okay. But she didn't pick up. Instead, I got another text, "I just need space." I understood that she might need some time to cool off, so I decided to back off, even though it hurt. I turned my focus to my schoolwork, which was piling up after all the late nights I'd spent helping her. But honestly, it was hard to concentrate. My mind kept wandering back to Sarah and everything that had happened. Was I wrong for snapping at her? Should I have handled things differently? Part of me felt guilty, but another part kept reminding me that I wasn't the one making destructive choices. Later that night, my phone rang. It was our mom, and she sounded angry the moment I picked up. I barely had time to say, "Hello," before she launched into it, telling me how disappointed she was in me for the way I'd treated Sarah. Apparently, Sarah had called her earlier that day and vented about everything that had happened. According to Mom, Sarah was devastated and felt like I had abandoned her when she needed me the most. She told Mom that I had berated her for being sad and made her feel like her emotions weren't valid. Worse, she said that I had refused to help her and left her to fend for herself when she was at her lowest. Hearing that made my blood boil. It was like everything I'd done for Sarah over the past 2 weeks had been completely erased. All the late-night pickups, the listening, the patience, it was like none of it mattered because I had dared to set boundaries and tell her some hard truths. I interrupted Mom, trying to explain my side of the story. I told her about the drinking, the reckless behavior, the constant emotional dumping. I told her how I'd gone out of my way to be there for Sarah even when it meant sacrificing my own peace of mind, and how I'd reached my breaking point when Sarah started lashing out at me for not doing enough. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a second, I thought maybe Mom understood where I was coming from. But then she said something that completely floored me, "Well, she's your sister. You're supposed to take care of her." I couldn't believe it. Sarah is 28 years old. She's an adult with a job, a therapist, and a social circle. I'm still in high school. At what point does she take responsibility for herself? How is it fair to expect me to keep putting her needs above my own, especially when she refuses to take accountability for her actions? Then Mom said something that hit me like a punch to the gut. "Sarah's been saying that she wishes you'd act more like I did when you were little. I always dropped everything for you." That was the moment everything clicked. Sarah didn't just want a sister, she wanted a parent. And for a split second, I felt guilty. Was I failing her? Was I really being cruel and heartless, like she said? But then that guilt turned into anger. Mom's words made me realize how much of my relationship with Sarah has been one-sided. I've been walking on eggshells around her for years, always trying to avoid triggering her insecurities or making her feel abandoned. Meanwhile, she's been taking and taking, never acknowledging the emotional toll it's had on me. It also stung because it felt like Mom was undermining me. I've spent so much time trying to support Sarah, and instead of seeing that, Mom was basically telling me it wasn't enough. Sarah wanted me to drop everything for her, like Mom used to do for me when I was a literal child. But I'm not her mom. I shouldn't have to sacrifice my mental health and my own life to fix her. Update 2. A few days passed in relative quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I was beginning to settle back into my routine, catching up on schoolwork, spending time with friends, and just trying to focus on myself for a change. But one morning, I woke up to find a letter slipped under my bedroom door. It was from Sarah. I stared at it for a while before opening it. Part of me wasn't ready to dive back into the chaos, but curiosity won out. The letter was handwritten, her penmanship neat and deliberate, which immediately made me think she'd spent time on it. It started with an apology. She admitted she'd been unfair to me, that she had leaned too hard on me and lashed out when I didn't meet her expectations. She wrote that she was sorry for making me feel like nothing I did was enough and that she knew I had been trying to help her. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the breakthrough I'd been waiting for, the moment she realized she couldn't keep acting this way. But then the tone of the letter shifted. She wrote, "I know I'm supposed to be the older sister, but sometimes I wish I could just be the little sister for once. I wish someone would take care of me the way I take care of everyone else." That stopped me dead in my tracks. What? Sarah doesn't take care of everyone else, she's the one people are always bending over backward to save. She's the one who calls at all hours, who expects people to drop everything for her, who spirals into destructive behavior and then relies on others to pick up the pieces. But the way she wrote it, it was like she genuinely believed she was this self-sacrificing caretaker who never got the care she deserved. It was so bizarre, so out of touch with reality, that I didn't even know how to process it. The rest of the letter was more of the same. She talked about how hard it was to always feel like she had to be the strong one, a claim that baffled me, considering she's never been the strong one in any scenario I can recall. She said she envied me for how mature and put together I was and how it seemed like I had everything figured out. She wrote, "Sometimes I just wish you'd take care of me, the way Mom used to take care of you when you were little." Would that really be so hard? When I finished reading, I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or scream. The letter felt like it was written by someone who had been living in an alternate reality. It was almost comical how deeply she believed this narrative where she was the unsung hero, the caretaker who never got cared for. But it also made me realize just how skewed her perception of our relationship, and herself, really was. She wasn't just leaning on me because of the breakup, she genuinely believed it was my job to take care of her. Later that week, she asked to meet for coffee. I didn't want to, but I agreed, partly out of guilt and partly out of curiosity about what she'd say. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a table, looking a little nervous but mostly composed. The conversation started off normal enough. She apologized again, more directly this time, and I told her I appreciated it. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd finally reached some kind of understanding. But then she brought up the letter. She said, "I just think it would be nice if, for once, you could treat me like I'm the younger sibling." She went on to explain that she saw me as this mature, responsible person and that she envied how I seemed to have it all together. She said she wanted to feel what it was like to not have to be the strong one all the time and that it would mean a lot to her if I could step up and take care of her, just for a little while. At first, I was confused. I asked her what she meant by, take care of her, and that's when things took a turn for the surreal. She said she wanted me to do things like make sure she was eating, check in on her regularly, and call to see if she was okay. When I pointed out that I'd already been doing that, she said, "Not like that. I mean, like how you take care of a little kid." She even mentioned how she'd always envied how I used to get tucked into bed when I was little. She said, "Would it really be so hard for you to, I don't know, bring me soup or something when I'm sad?" I was stunned. It was the most absurd conversation I'd ever had. Here she was, a 28-year-old woman, asking her 17-year-old sister to essentially play mommy for her. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was like she didn't see the fundamental problem with what she was asking. I told her I love her and that I'm always here to support her, but I'm not her parent. I reminded her that she's an adult, and it's not my job, or anyone else's, to take care of her the way a parent would take care of a child. She didn't take that well. Her expression shifted, and she accused me of being cold and unfeeling. She said I didn't understand what it was like to feel so overwhelmed and that I was lucky to be so together. She said all she wanted was to feel safe and cared for, and I was making her feel like she was asking for too much. It was clear she saw herself as the victim, and no amount of reasoning was going to change her mind. The conversation ended with her storming off, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. I felt a mix of frustration, sadness, and exhaustion. I realized then that no matter how much I love Sarah, there's a limit to what I can do for her. She has to want to change, to take responsibility for her life and her actions. I can't be the one to save her, and I can't let her drag me down with her. Update 3. Things finally came to a head about a week later. I was at home, trying to finish a paper for school, when I heard a knock at the door. It was Sarah. She hadn't called or texted to say she was coming over, which was already unusual, but the moment I saw her, I knew something was wrong. She had clearly been drinking, her face was flushed, her hair was a mess, and she reeked of alcohol. Before I could even say anything, she pushed past me into the house, muttering under her breath about how I never answer her calls, which wasn't true, and how family doesn't treat each other this way. I closed the door and braced myself. I had a bad feeling about where this was headed, and I wasn't wrong. Sarah immediately launched into a rant about how I don't care about family, and how I don't know how to be a sister. She said I'd abandoned her in her time of need and that all she wanted was for someone to step up and take care of her for once. Her words were slurred, and her tone was that awful combination of anger and self-pity that I'd come to dread. She started going on about how much pressure she's under, how she's always the one people rely on, and how she just wants someone to baby her for a while. She said she's tired of being the older sister, tired of always having to be the strong one, which, again, is completely disconnected from reality. Sarah has never been the strong one. Then, to my absolute disbelief, she told me she'd even talked to Mom about the idea of me moving in with her to help her get back on track. I stood there, stunned, as she ranted about how perfect it would be. I could keep an eye on her, make sure she was eating, help her clean, and just be there for her so she didn't feel so alone. It was as if she genuinely thought I had nothing else going on in my life and could just drop everything to become her live-in caretaker. I was 17, for crying out loud. I still lived at home, I was in school, and I had my own responsibilities. But in Sarah's mind, none of that mattered. All she cared about was finding someone, anyone, to shoulder the emotional burden she refused to deal with herself. That was it for me. I had reached my breaking point. I didn't yell, and I didn't cry. I just pulled out my phone and called Mom. I told her she needed to come over right away because I couldn't handle this on my own. To her credit, Mom didn't argue. She said she'd be there in 20 minutes. In the meantime, I sat Sarah down and told her to stay put. She kept mumbling under her breath about how I was so dramatic and just like everyone else, but I ignored her. I was done trying to reason with her. When Mom arrived, I wasted no time. I told her everything, how Sarah had shown up drunk, how she'd been pressuring me to take care of her, and how she was now floating the absurd idea that I should move in with her. Mom looked as exhausted as I felt, but to my surprise, she actually backed me up. She turned to Sarah and said, "You can't keep doing this. This isn't fair to anyone, and it's time for you to take responsibility for yourself." Sarah didn't take it well. She started crying, saying that we were ganging up on her and that no one understood how hard things were for her. She said she was just trying to cope the best way she knew how, and she didn't know why we couldn't just support her instead of attacking her. But Mom didn't back down. She told Sarah, "We're not ganging up on you. We're trying to help you see that this isn't sustainable." That was the first time I'd ever seen Mom really hold Sarah accountable, and it was such a relief. For years, Mom had been one of Sarah's biggest enablers, always swooping in to fix her problems or make excuses for her behavior. But in that moment, she was firm. She told Sarah that she loved her, but it wasn't fair to expect everyone else to carry her through life. She said Sarah had resources, her therapist, her friends, even our parents, but she refused to use them because she was too busy wallowing in self-pity. And she was right. Sarah has so many people who care about her and want to help her, but she's so stuck in her victim mindset that she can't see it. Sarah didn't take it well. She cried harder and accused us of being cold and unfeeling, but for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I knew we weren't being cruel, we were setting boundaries. And those boundaries were necessary. Eventually, Sarah stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Mom and I sat in silence for a while after she left. I think we were both trying to process what had just happened. Mom finally broke the silence and said, "You were right to call me. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." That meant more to me than I could express. For so long, I'd felt like I was fighting this battle alone, like I was the only one who saw how toxic things had become. Hearing Mom acknowledge it felt like validation, like I wasn't crazy for feeling overwhelmed. Since that night, things have been different. Sarah has been keeping her distance, which honestly feels like a blessing. A couple of days ago, she texted me to say she's going back to therapy and trying to figure things out. I told her I was proud of her and that I'll always be here for her, but I also made it clear that I'm sticking to my boundaries. I won't let her guilt me into sacrificing my own mental health for her anymore. It's hard, because I do love her. I want her to be okay, and I want us to have a good relationship. But I've realized that the only way that can happen is if she takes responsibility for herself. I can't fix her, and I can't save her. She has to do that on her own. For now, I'm focusing on myself. I'm staying on top of my schoolwork, spending time with my friends, and trying to rebuild my own sense of peace. It's not easy, but it feels right. And maybe, just maybe, this will be the turning point for both of us. I hope Sarah finds her way, I really do. But I've learned that I can't lose myself trying to help her get there.